Alright everyone, we start off today with a video response actually to Timpool. He's got a poll, link in the description, not archived of course, and I'll also pin it at the top in the comments on YouTube for people to go to. You can interact with it, weigh in, whatever. I chose to respond to his specific poll here. It's, should the mentally ill be allowed to own guns? And I did respond to this, but I figured my thoughts on this maybe are more in the historical context, so I needed to make a video. I'd love to talk about him on his talk about this on his show actually with him, but of course I'm not in the United States at the moment, and you can't phone in, so I'll do it in a video response here. Here's the long story short. Yes, the mentally ill should own guns. Generally speaking, there's a little bit of historical context that we need to understand, especially in the wake of the Bruin decision, of course, going back to court originalism with regards to the treatment of the Constitution. I have a feeling that Bruin will be more useful in the end than just for the Second Amendment, by the way. I think it'll have ramifications for the 1st, 4th, and 10th as well down the road, and possibly a trial law, but we'll see what happens. How many cases of successful dovetailing can be done with the idea of originalism as implemented by the current Supreme Court? Here's my answer. First, we have to look at the context of the late 1700s. We're talking about an era prior to the rise of Thomsonian medicine, prior to the rise of Victorian medicine. We're talking about a situation in which most of what we consider mental illnesses today weren't cataloged. The founders would not have considered a person who is depressed, for example, to have any problem other than a melancholic disposition. They still went on Humeric theory. So the theory of the four humors is the idea that blood and phlegm and two sorts of bile, black bile and yellow bile, I think, basically governed the body's disposition. And a person could be more sanguine, so maybe more aggressive. A person could be more melancholy, they're more phlegmatic. They tend towards the dour, they tend towards the humorless side. Depression would have been considered simply an imbalance of the humors. How would they have treated it at the time prior to the rise of Thomsonian botanic medicine in roughly the early part of the 19th century? Because that's when the founders were writing the Constitution. They would have treated it with emetics, mainly. They would have attempted to purge the excess phlegm from the body. They would have given something, a diaphoretic perhaps, an enema. They would have resorted to bloodletting to reduce the blood, etc., etc. They would have balanced the humors. Unless it was really severe and the person were constantly trying to hang themselves, they probably would not lock them away, although they did institutionalize. And the litmus test becomes, for mental illness purposes, would the person have been locked away and deprived of rights other than the right to bear arms in the late 1700s based on their condition? Now, this would have been the case for a very small proportion of the people labeled mentally ill today. The problem with saying, well, we should take away mental ill people's guns, and a frightening number of people on this poll appear to believe that's a good idea, is that a state-funded far-leftoid psychiatrist could deem you unfit and you could be deprived of one of your rights, which under Bruin is not subjugate or secondary to any of the other constitutional rights. Well, you would technically be making a case for robbing them of their right to speak freely, robbing them of their right to privacy, robbing them of the right to vote, etc., 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 on down the line. Clearly, that wouldn't sit well with the average person. For some reason, the purchasing of firearms is considered by the public to be separate from the other constitutional rights. Again, we now have a binding Supreme Court decision saying that ain't the case. The problem is that most of the people labeled mentally ill today would not have been conceived of as mentally ill then. Seasonal affective. Oh, you get sad during the winter. Well, it's a mental illness now. Back then it's called it's fucking winter. And you happen to be in a shitty climate. Depression. You've got an imbalance of the phlegmatic, the melancholic side of your humors. Oppositional defiant disorder. Okay, you're just an asshole. But it wouldn't have been considered a mental illness. It would have been considered a character trait. Other than lunacy, that is explicit lunacy, you're seeing and hearing things that aren't there. You're a constant danger to others. You're the town lunatic. You're the fool of the town, basically. You're the fool on the hill. Other than the interesting lunatics and the dangerous lunatics, nobody else would have fallen under the umbrella that they would have taken guns from. they would not have been considered part of the militia because they're incapable of using them, number one, effectively, and number two, safely for the people around them in their community. They can't be part of the militia because they can't be trusted to have a musket at home, in other words. Other than that, everyone else who's mentally ill, yeah, they should own guns. Everyone should own guns. Others should own them on behalf of the lunatics, but there are very few of them in our society. If someone is a psycho, generally speaking, one main litmus test would have been, have they been locked up for murder or something like that? If their community knows them to be a violent individual, a deranged individual, yes, back then they wouldn't have even gone through a trial process. They would have been declared incompetent, and this has been misused, by the way. We'll get into that in a moment, unfortunately. They would have been declared incompetent. They would not be able to manage their own property. It would be in trust, etc., maybe with relatives or a friend or something. They would not have been owning musket, maybe one that didn't have any powder to it so they could parade around with it in the halls of the asylum, the nut ward or something like that. By the way, the asylum system comes later generally too. That would be the only litmus test. If you apply Bruin's originalism and you apply an understanding of the historical backdrop of the late 1700s, yes, most of the people labeled mentally ill today would not have been considered so back in the late 1700s. It wouldn't be until relatively recently that happened. In fact, the eugenics movement has more to do with the institutionalization of people that are otherwise generally normal. And then you have the concept of misuse of the law. So you've got the eccentric lady at the corner at the end of your street, and she yells at one too many neighbors. Now, she's not a lunatic. She's not doing anything violent. She's just an asshole. She's lost it. She's off her rocker in the sense that she doesn't like other people. She's sociophobic. There have been cases where people like that are robbed of their liberty simply because the community complains. They get some sympathetic judge who says, well, clearly, Mrs. Smith, there's something wrong with you. Yeah, you're just basically an angry cat lady, but we're going to take your house away and lock you up in a nut ward. How wonderful. Should that be happening? Should a person who is not a clear threat to others, and if they're a threat to themselves, it doesn't really apply at all because, the only crime they're going to potentially commit with a gun is killing themselves, and there are a dozen other ways they could be doing that too. Let me ask this rhetorically: should the mentally ill be able to buy aspirin? Because you can kill yourself or others with aspirin. Should they be able to buy? Should they be able to buy any toxic compound at the hardware store? Should they be able to buy bleach? Should they be able to vote? I would think that a person who's not quite right voting would be more important as an issue than them owning a gun. But for some reason, people think the latter is subjugate to all the other constitutional rights. And that's just not the case. So to Timpool's poll, I voted yes. The mentally ill should be able to own guns. Again, unless they are a violent criminal lunatic. Hell, felons should own guns. Most of the felons in the country, what is it? It's tax fraud or something like that. It has nothing to do with a violent crime. They didn't kill anyone. They didn't run over a bunch of school children. If they did, they should be permanently institutionalized. They would have been considered criminal lunatics. There should be no parole for them unless they're very, very heavily doped up to the point where they can see the light or whatever goofy bullshit they do in prison hospitals these days. They would be a criminal lunatic. Is a tax cheat a criminal lunatic according to the 1700s? No, they're criminal, but they're not a lunatic. They're not violent. They're not being dangerous to anyone. They just skeeved on their taxes and got a felony charge. Felons should own weapons as well. By the way, they can own flamethrowers. They can own pneumatic pistols and rifles. They can own all manner of wonderful weapons that are not scheduled by the ATF in the normal way because they're not normal firearms. They can own black powder weapons for some reason. Why the fuck not let them have a little 22? It doesn't really make any sense. Even if they were massively assaulting people before and in on a violent crime, it's sort of like if the person's truly violent to the point where you think they're going to do something wrong, they should still be in prison. If they're not, if you think that they've seen the light, they're at least willing to avoid that confrontation, yeah, they should be able to own weapons. They can already get them illicitly anyway, so what's the fucking point? It makes no sense. A lot of the gun violence in the United States, it's just one-off thug crime in the inner cities anyway by people who their criminal record doesn't have a violent crime before. Now they've joined the Crips and they have to do their first drive-by to prove that they're worthy or something like that. Yes, absolutely, the mentally ill should own guns. Again, because the concept of mental illness used today is massively more expansive, legalistic, and potentially misused than it was in the late 18th century. And that's the long and short of it. That's about all. Peace out.